Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on an ingredient that's probably in your pantry right now and has been at the center of a decades-long controversy, monosodium glutamate, or MSG.
That's right. For the longest time, major regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US basically gave MSG a green light. It was classified as generally recognized as safe, GRAS, and its acceptable daily intake, or ADI, was listed as not specified, which, essentially means its toxicity is considered so low that there's no practical limit.
Exactly. But that long-standing consensus has just been shattered. The European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, did a massive reevaluation and came to a very different conclusion. They've now set a hard numerical ADI, 30 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. And that decision, well, it fundamentally challenges the safety assumptions we've operated under for over 50 years.
And that number, 30 milligrams, is now the new battleground.
Absolutely. So the debate today really gets to the heart of regulatory philosophy. Should glutamate, which is both a nutrient we need and a food additive, be restricted by the specific ADI? Or should we go back to the not specified status, which reflects its low toxicity and its vital role in our metabolism? I'm going to argue that this new restrictive ADI is fundamentally flawed and just doesn't line up with the science of how our bodies handle this molecule.
And I'll be arguing that setting this specific numerical ADI is not only necessary, but frankly a prudent regulatory step. This decision is a direct response to real toxicological signals seen in animal models. And crucially, it acknowledges that some vulnerable groups are already consuming glutamate at levels that meet or even exceed this new threshold. So a clear, health-based guidepost is essential.
I understand the impulse for caution, I do. But let's look at this from a physiological perspective. The old ADI not specified designation, which was upheld for years by global experts at JECFA and the EU's own Scientific Committee for Food, well, it got it right. It accurately reflects glutamate's safety profile. We're not talking about some alien synthetic chemical here. This is a non-essential amino acid that is, deeply woven into our metabolism. It's a nutrient first and additive second. The most powerful evidence for this is in the toxicokinetics. The data is just crystal clear. When you eat glutamate, your gut lining, the enterocytes, go to work immediately. About 90% of it is metabolized right there in what's called the splanchnic area. It's used for fuel. This first pass clearance is an incredible natural safety barrier, and it means very little free glutamate ever reaches your systemic blood, whether it's from a steak or from a flavor packet.
In fact, MSG as an additive usually only makes up about 6 to 12% of our total glutamate intake anyway.
Okay, I absolutely acknowledge glutamate's role as a nutrient and the efficiency of that splanchnic metabolism. No one is debating that. But to say its ADI should be not specified, which implies, unlimited consumption, that feels scientifically negligent when we have a body of evidence pointing to potential adverse effects. The very fact that EFSA established this 30 milligram figure based on a specific toxicological study proves that a defined threshold is needed. They zeroed in on a neurodevelopmental toxicity study in rats, and from that, they identified a NOAEL, a no observed adverse effect level, of 3,200 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. And we have to apply this caution because the exposure levels aren't just theoretical. The normal dietary intake of total free glutamate, so both natural and additive forms, can hit 37 milligrams per kilogram per day in toddlers. And if you look at total glutamates, including from protein, that number just skyrockets to 474. So when normal eating habits in our most sensitive groups are already pushing past that proposed ADI, moving away from not specified isn't just a good idea. It's a public health requirement.
But let's go back to that metabolic clearance, because this is the scientific pillar that the restrictive ADI just seems to ignore. The gut is an active defense mechanism. Your plasma glutamate levels only spike under really unnatural conditions that completely overwhelm that system. To get to a neurotoxic level in the blood, we're talking about 3,500 micromoles per liter. You have to literally pump massive doses, like 3,000 or 4,000 milligrams per kilo, directly into a rodent's stomach.
Now, compare that to solid human data. In one study, researchers gave a huge dose, 160 milligrams of MSG per kilogram, to fasting human subjects. Worst case scenario, right? It caused an 11-fold spike in their plasma glutamate up to about 530 micromoles per liter. But here's the kicker. Even that massive surge wasn't enough to cause any measurable neuroendocrine effects. So if you can take an extreme dose on an empty stomach and still be 6 or 7 times below the neurotoxic threshold, what are we really regulating? The body is built to handle this.
That's a fair point about the high systemic threshold, but I think you're missing the pharmacokinetic shift that happens when you add free glutamate to a meal. Yes, the gut barrier is strong, but adding the free form absolutely changes the timing and rate of absorption. There are studies showing that if you add 150 milligrams per kilo of MSG to a protein-rich meal, the plasma glutamate peak hits much earlier, 45 minutes versus 150. And it's significantly higher, over 4 times the baseline, compared to just the meal alone. So the problem isn't just about breaching a massive toxic threshold, it's about regulatory prudence. And we can't just wish away the fact that vulnerable groups exceed this ADI through totally natural means. For instance, the amount of free glutamate naturally found in breast milk can be quite high. This means a 2 to 6 month old infant can easily consume around or even more than 30 milligrams per kilogram per day. If natural, normal feeding in infants already puts them over the regulatory limit for an additive, that tells me that 30 milligrams per kilo is a reasonable and necessary note of caution for public health standard.
I think the real reason we're even having this debate is because the scientific foundation for EFSA's ADI is, to be blunt, pretty shaky. We have to challenge the study they chose to base everything on. They used this for his developmental study, and I would argue that relying on a study where the NOAEL, that 3,200 milligram per day figure, is so high it's bordering on the maximum dose you can even give a rat without causing just general nutritional imbalance, well, that complicates things immensely.
How so? The study found effects.
Because you start confusing nutritional stress with specific glutamate toxicity. When you're feeding animals such incredibly high doses you could be causing metabolic or osmotic stress, it becomes almost impossible to say for sure that the adverse outcomes are from glutamate's neurotoxicity and not just from the animal being physically overwhelmed. And what's more, Voorhees himself, the author of that study, later said that the behavioral effects he saw were minor and probably didn't provide a robust basis for setting a definitive ADI. It feels like EFSA picked an endpoint that was statistically there but biologically questionable.
Like delayed swimming development and altered avoidance learning in the rat pups. When a regulatory body sees an adverse developmental endpoint, they are obligated to act on the lowest observed NOEL they can find. And the picture is broader than just neurodevelopment. Other animal studies have shown systemic toxicity. Doses between 0.5 gram and 1.5 grams per kilo have been shown to increase oxidative stress in cardiac tissue and decrease acetylcholinesterase activity in red blood cells. I mean, that points to a clear mechanism for toxicity through oxidative stress. So a numerical health-based value has to account for all these different biological signals, not just whether or not you can see physical brain lesions.
But if we're really looking for a solid toxicological starting point, one that isn't muddied by these confounding factors, there's much better evidence out there. I'd point to the enanthramin 3-generation reproductive toxicity study. It was done in mice, which are a sensitive model, across multiple generations, and it found no adverse effects, including no brain lesions, at doses up to 6,000 milligrams per kilogram per day. That's almost double the NOEL that EFSA relied on. Now, if we take that superior enanthramin data and apply a more rational uncertainty factor, say 25 instead of the default 100, which is justified because the toxicokinetics of glutamate are so similar in rats and humans, you get a very different ADI. You get at least 240 milligrams per kilogram per day, an 8-fold difference. That number, 240, strongly supports the long-held conclusion that glutamate is safe at high dietary levels, and frankly, it invalidates this new restrictive 30 milligram limit.
That's a compelling case for a theoretical higher ADI if all we care about is the absence of anatomical damage in long-term studies. But regulation also has to deal with the acute functional effects that people report, which you just can't model properly in a rodent.
Which brings us to the infamous MSG symptom complex. I really believe this has driven so much undue public fear. The concerns about headaches, numbness, flushing, they are largely unfounded when glutamate is eaten as it's meant to be. in a meal. Time and again, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies have failed to show reproducible symptoms, even in people who claim they're sensitive, when they're given a big dose, like 5,000 milligrams mixed into food. The issue only seems to pop up under highly unnatural conditions, like taking a huge dose on a totally empty stomach. And while we're at it, let's talk about weight gain. Big epidemiological studies like the Jiangsu Nutrition Study in China found that after you adjust for all the confounding factors, like what else people are eating, MSG intake was not associated with obesity or significant weight gain over 5 years. It's a classic case of confusing correlation with causation.
I see that clinical data very differently. While the full complex might be hard to pin down, trials have found acute, measurable effects in some people, which suggests there's a real subset of the population that responds. Multiple double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover studies found a significant increase in headaches in the MSG groups versus placebo, even at moderate doses of 5 grams in a drink or 75 milligrams per kilo. That proves that for some people, added free glutamate is not harmless. And on the metabolic syndrome issue, we have to be cautious. Large studies in Southeast Asia, particularly in Thailand, have linked high consumption. We're talking over 3.8 grams a day, which is more than 50 milligrams per kilo for many adults, with a higher risk of being overweight. And critically, these studies controlled for calories and fat, which didn't differ between the high and low MSG groups. That points to a direct association that from a public health standpoint, you simply cannot dismiss.
The distinction here is crucial, though. We're debating whether the long-standing regulatory standard for a common nutrient should be overturned. The overwhelming weight of evidence, from the splanchnic metabolism that protects us to the superior animal studies showing no effects at high doses, it all points to glutamate being fundamentally safe at any normal dietary level. EFSA's decision to set a restrictive ADI of 30 milligrams is just inconsistent with the bulk of the toxicokinetic and toxicological data. The traditional, not specified ADI is still the most appropriate and scientifically sound measure for a macronutrient like this.
But given all the reported biological effects, the oxidative stress markers, the changes in ACHE activity in animal models, and the verifiable clinical data on headaches and metabolic links in humans, regulatory bodies are absolutely right to apply the precautionary principle. Establishing a numerical ADI, even a conservative one, is the responsible thing to do, especially when routine exposure in our most vulnerable groups, like infants on breast milk, already meets or exceeds that 30 milligram threshold. That alone shows the need for a conservative benchmark that forces us to consider total intake.
Ultimately, I think this whole debate just underscores how incredibly complex these public health determinations are. The core question is this: do we regulate based on the overwhelming evidence of a highly effective physiological defense system built into our own bodies? Or do we regulate based on a precautionary principle applied to sensitive endpoints and worst-case scenarios?
It's a profound philosophical difference in regulatory science, isn't it? It all comes down to whether you view glutamate primarily as a naturally safe nutrient or as an added chemical that requires strict limits to protect every single consumer, especially the most vulnerable.